My name is Emily, and I suppose I should start with why we even came here in the first place. My parents had grown tired of the noise and pace of the city. They said Hollow Creek would be a fresh start, a quiet town where people still smiled at one another on the street, where the nights were dark and still, and where nothing bad ever happened. At least, that was the promise. From the car window, Hollow Creek looked almost like a painting frozen in time. A cluster of wooden houses with sagging porches, a church whose steeple leaned slightly to one side, a single school standing proudly at the top of a hill, even though the paint was peeling from its walls. There was a general store, a gas station, and little else. It wasn't ugly, but there was a heaviness to the air that pressed down on me the moment we drove in, as if the whole place was holding its breath. The townsfolk watched us unload our things. Their faces were unreadable, their eyes following me in a way that wasn't exactly unfriendly, but not welcoming either. It was like they knew something about me that I didn't. At night, the silence was almost unbearable. In the city, there had always been noise, traffic, sirens, voices through thin apartment walls. Here, there was nothing but the sound of crickets and the whisper of the wind moving through the trees. And sometimes, when the wind died, I thought I could hear something else. Faint voices, the kind children make when they laugh from a distance. My parents didn't notice. They were too busy congratulating themselves on finding such a perfect, peaceful town. But I knew right away, Hollow Creek was not ordinary. It was hiding something, and whether I wanted to or not, I was already a part of it. The first few days in Hollow Creek were painfully slow. I wandered the narrow streets, memorized the cracked sidewalks, and counted the faded for sale signs on houses that looked abandoned long before we moved here. Most of the kids I saw were either much younger than me or didn't look interested in talking. That's why, when I finally noticed a group of children standing at the far end of the field near the church, I felt a small spark of relief. At first, I thought they were playing tag or hide and seek. They stood in a circle, moving slowly, their hands twitching in strange patterns, their lips barely moving. They looked up the moment they noticed me, and I froze. Something about them made my stomach tighten. Their faces were pale, not sickly, but almost chalk-like, as if sunlight hadn't touched them in years. Their clothes were wrong. One boy wore a stiff, buttoned shirt with a collar too high for comfort, tucked in a brown woolen trousers held up by suspenders. Another girl wore a white dress that looked like it belonged in an old photograph. Long sleeves, lace at the collar, and shoes that clicked sharply against the stones when she shifted her weight. All of them seemed pulled out of another time entirely. And yet they smiled. Their smiles weren't wide or natural, but small and knowing, as though they were in on some secret. "Do you want to play with us?" one of them asked. Her voice was light, but it carried a strange echo, as if the air bent around her words. I hesitated, then nodded, because what else was I supposed to do? Saying no felt dangerous, though I couldn't explain why. I stepped closer, and that's when I heard it, the whispering. The children were murmuring under their breath, words strung together like a rhyme. I thought maybe it was a game, some local song I didn't know. "What are you saying?" I asked. They all stopped at once. The stillness was unnatural, like a film paused on a single frame. Then one boy, no older than 10, tilted his head toward me. His eyes were so dark they almost swallowed his pupils. "We are counting," he said. My skin prickled. "Counting what?" Another girl, the one in the white dress, answered softly. "Counting the hours. Waiting for night." The group broke into a low giggle, but there was no joy in it. It was the kind of laughter that scraped against your nerves. I forced myself to smile, pretending I wasn't unsettled, and backed away with a muttered excuse about my parents needing me at home. Their eyes followed me as I walked, the giggling still ringing in my ears. Only when I turned the corner and the children were no longer in sight did I realize something strange. None of them had cast a shadow in the evening sun. The warnings about the forest began almost as soon as we arrived. It seemed like every adult I spoke to mentioned it, slipping it into conversation as though it were casual advice. "Don't go there. It's not safe. Best to keep to the paths around town." My parents repeated the warnings, though I could tell they hadn't asked for details. They were too busy painting our new life as idyllic to question why a forest would terrify an entire town. But the children I'd met in the field didn't seem afraid. Every evening, just as the last rays of sun disappeared, I saw them drift toward the trees. They never ran or shouted like normal kids would. They walked in a straight, deliberate line, their bodies weaving in and out of the fading light until they melted into the shadows beneath the branches. I told myself not to follow. Every instinct screamed that whatever lay beyond the tree line wasn't meant for me. But curiosity can be louder than fear. And Hollow Creek had a way of pressing in on you until you felt like you couldn't breathe unless you knew. One evening, I waited until my parents were distracted unpacking boxes and slipped out of the house. The air outside was unnaturally still, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. I spotted the children just ahead, their pale shapes barely visible in the twilight, and hurried after them. The moment I stepped past the first row of trees, the world changed. The sounds of Hollow Creek, the faint hum of cars, the distant chatter of voices, cut off entirely. The forest swallowed everything. The air was colder here, biting in my skin, and the silence was so complete it roared in my ears. I quickened my pace, following the glimpses of white fabric and dark trousers flickering between the trunks. But the deeper I went, the harder it became to keep track of them. One second they were right in front of me, and the next they seemed farther away, slipping behind twisted trees, always just beyond reach. Finally, I stopped in a small clearing. The ground was covered in dead, leaves that crunched softly beneath my shoes. I turned in a slow circle, my chest tight, realizing the children were gone. Completely gone. No footsteps, no giggles, no whispering, just emptiness. That was when I heard it, a sound so faint it barely reached my ears. The sound of laughter, not the cheerful laughter of children, but something sharp and mocking. It came from behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The trees pressed closer, their branches tangling overhead until they blotted out the last streaks of twilight. The laughter grew louder, moving around me in a circle, as if unseen figures darted from tree to tree. My breath caught in my throat, and I bolted, crashing through the undergrowth until I stumbled out onto the edge of town. When I turned back, the forest loomed black and endless, its shadows writhing like they were alive. And in the darkness, I could swear I saw small faces peeking out between the trees, watching me. School in Hollow Creek was like stepping into a building that belonged in another decade. The walls were yellowed, the desk scarred with initials carved long ago, and the air smelled faintly of dust and chalk. There were so few students that my grade was taught in a combined classroom, and most of them already knew each other from childhood. They weren't unkind, but they kept a polite distance, like I was someone they didn't quite want to let in. It was the teachers who made the strongest impression. Most of them seemed worn down, moving through the halls like shadows. But one stood out, Mrs. Harlow, the oldest teacher in the building. Her hair was thin and gray, her back bent with age, but her eyes were sharp, as though she noticed far more than she let on. I caught her watching me more than once. At first, I thought it was because I was new, but there was something in her gaze that unsettled me. Not suspicion, but recognition. Like she already knew who I was. One afternoon, when class ended and the others hurried out, I lingered. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I wanted answers. Maybe I just wanted to test whether she really was watching me the way I thought. Mrs. Harlow, I asked quietly, do you know about the children who play in the fields? The ones who go into the forest. The color drained from her face. For a long time, she didn't speak, only adjusted her glasses with trembling fingers. Finally, she sighed and gestured for me to sit. Many years ago, she said, her voice rasping with age, I was still young, teaching my very first class here in Hollow Creek. 30 children, bright and eager. We went on a field trip into the forest. It was only supposed to be a simple walk, to collect leaves, to learn about the land. Her voice faltered, but they never came back. I stared at her, thinking I'd misheard. What do you mean, they never came back? Her eyes watered. One moment they were laughing, chasing each other between the trees. The next moment, silence. I turned, and they were gone. Every one of them. My skin prickled, and no one found them. Mrs. Harlow shook her head slowly. The town searched for weeks. The police came. The forest was torn apart tree by tree. But the children had vanished, as though the earth swallowed them whole. She leaned closer then, her voice lowering to a whisper. And ever since, people claim to hear them. Their singing, their laughter, always at night, always near the forest. Some say they're calling to the living, begging us to join them. Others say they are not children anymore, but something that wears their faces. The room seemed colder. Outside the window, the afternoon sun dimmed behind a cloud, leaving the classroom in shadow. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Mrs. Harlow's hand shook as she reached in her desk drawer. She pulled out a faded photograph and slid it across to me. It showed a group of children in old-fashioned clothing, smiling stiffly at the camera in front of the school. My breath caught. They looked exactly like the ones I'd seen. "You asked who they are," she whispered. "They're the ones who never left." That night, I struggled to fall asleep. The photograph Mrs. Harlow had shown me stayed fixed in my mind. The pale faces, the stiff clothing, the two wide eyes. I kept replaying her words. They're the ones who never left. The house was quiet. My parents had gone to bed early, exhausted from unpacking. The clock ticked in the hallway, steady and sharp in the silence. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, until I heard it. At first, it was faint, a thin thread of sound weaving through the darkness. Singing. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. The melody was strange, lilting, carrying a rhythm that didn't belong to any song I knew. The voices were soft but layered, dozens of them overlapping like a choir, their pitch slightly off, as though the voices belonged to throats that hadn't sung in years. Heart pounding, I crept to the window and pulled the curtain aside, and froze. They were there, the children, the same pale figures I'd seen in the fields. They stood below my window in a perfect half circle, their heads tilted up toward me, faces glowing faintly in the moonlight. Their mouths moved in unison, shaping words I couldn't understand. It wasn't English, though every now and then a familiar syllable slipped through. The rest was some older tongue, cracked and broken by time. One of them, the girl in the white dress, stepped forward. She didn't blink. Her lips formed my name. Emily. I stumbled back from the window, my chest heaving. My name again, this time from another voice, a boy at the front of the group. Then another. Then all of them. Emily. 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 Their chorus swelled. No longer just a song, but a chant, their voices rising and falling like waves. My head spun. It felt as though the sound wasn't just outside. It was in the room with me, vibrating in the walls, slipping beneath my skin. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The chant drilled straight into my skull, until I thought I might scream. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the voices stopped. I forced myself to peek outside once more. The children were gone. The yard was empty. The grass swayed gently in the breeze, but there was no sign that anyone had stood there at all. I dropped back into bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin. My heart was still racing, my body trembling. Somewhere deep inside, I already knew the truth. These were no ordinary children. They were the ones from the photograph. The missing class. The ones who had gone into the forest and never come out. And now, they knew my name. The next morning, sunlight poured weakly through the window, but it didn't bring comfort. I woke late, my body heavy as though I hadn't slept at all. My dreams had been filled with whispers, the echo of voices calling my name. For a long time, I lay in bed, convincing myself it had been a dream, some strange nightmare born from Mrs. Harlow's story. But when I finally went downstairs, my breath caught. On the front porch, etched deep into the wooden railing, were dozens of lines. Small vertical scratches, grouped in fives like someone counting days in a prison cell. They stretched across the wood in uneven rows, some fresh and sharp, others worn and faded as though they'd been there for years. I crouched closer, running my fingers over the grooves. The marks were rough, splintering beneath my touch. Whoever made them hadn't bothered with neatness. They were desperate, carved quickly, angrily. "Emily? Everything okay out there?" my mom called from inside. I jerked upright, heart racing. Yeah, I lied. Just looking at the porch. But the truth pressed against me like a weight. These marks hadn't been there the night before. I was sure of it. Later, when my parents drove into town for supplies, I lingered behind. I couldn't stop thinking about those scratches. They weren't random. They were tallies. But why? Counting days? Weeks? Months? The answer came to me like a whisper I didn't want to hear. They were waiting. I walked back outside, drawn to the marks like a moth to flame. At the end of one row, scratched deeper than the rest, was a single word. The letters were jagged, uneven, but I could read them clearly. Soon, a chill crawled over my skin. The children weren't just watching. They weren't just calling my name. They were counting down. And the tally marks on my porch told me one horrifying thing. They weren't finished. That night, when the crickets fell silent, I lay awake listening. I thought I heard faint scratching outside, like nails dragging across wood. I didn't dare look. The attic in our new house was a place I had avoided. From the first day, something about it made me uneasy. The wooden ladder creaked like bones, and the air above smelled of mildew and dust, as if the space hadn't been opened in decades. But after the tally marks appeared on the porch, I felt a pull to search, to see if this house held its own secrets. The sun was sinking low when I climbed the ladder. Dust swirled in the narrow beam of light cutting through the small window, catching in my throat and making me cough. Old boxes lay stacked in crooked piles, some spilling open with yellowed newspapers, broken toys, and clothes that looked 2 generations too old. One box caught my attention. It was smaller than the others, tucked beneath a moth-eaten quilt. Written across the lid, in faded black ink, was the word, school. My chest tightened. With shaking fingers, I pulled it toward me and lifted the lid. Inside were old report cards, lesson plans, and a handful of photographs, their edges curled and brittle. The top photograph nearly slid from my hands when I saw it. It was a group portrait, 30 children standing in front of Hollow Creek School. Their faces were pale, but smiling stiffly at the camera, their clothes old-fashioned, just like the children I'd seen. My stomach turned. They were the same children, the very same. And then my eyes locked on one girl near the edge of the group. Her features froze me in place. Dark hair parted neatly to the side, a sharp chin, a face I knew too well. It was me, or someone who looked exactly like me. Hands trembling, I flipped the photo over. On the back, written in faded ink, was a list of names. I scanned quickly, my breath growing shallow. And there it was, near the bottom. Emily. The photo slipped from my hands, fluttering to the floor. My pulse roared in my ears. I staggered back, nearly tripping over another box. Questions pounded through my head, each worse than the last. How could my name be there? How could someone who looked like me have stood among those children, decades before I was even born? Downstairs, I heard the front door open. My parents' voices drifted up, casual and oblivious. I stuffed the photo back into the box, slamming the lid shut as if that could erase what I'd seen. But it was too late. The truth had already sunk into my bones. The children weren't just strangers haunting Hollow Creek. Somehow, impossibly, they were tied to me. And they had been waiting for my return. I couldn't stay inside after finding that photograph. The house felt like it was closing in around me, every creak of the floorboards whispering secrets I didn't want to hear. My parents were downstairs, laughing over dinner like nothing was wrong, but I couldn't eat. All I could think about was the face in that photo. My face, smiling stiffly among the missing children. The forest called to me. I don't know how else to explain it. Its dark outline on the horizon pulled at my chest like a hook lodged beneath my ribs. I told myself I only wanted answers, but deep down I already knew. Whatever truth I found would not be kind. The sun was low when I slipped out. The streets of Hollow Creek were nearly empty, as they always were in the evenings. Doors locked, curtains drawn. Nobody dared linger once shadows stretched across the ground. I was the only one walking toward the tree line. The air grew colder with each step. When I entered the forest, the silence hit me like a wall. Even the crickets hushed, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I forced myself deeper, following the faintest sound, a rustle, a whisper of movement. And then I saw them, shapes in the trees, dozens of them. At first I thought they were tricks of the fading light, shadows bending unnaturally, but then they shifted. Small figures, children, They didn't move like normal kids. Their bodies seemed to glide rather than walk, their outlines blurred by the dimness. Their faces were pale, their eyes shining faintly like wet stones. They didn't come closer, not yet. They only watched. A cold shiver crawled up my spine as one of them stepped forward. It was the girl in the white dress. She raised a hand, palm facing me, her lips moving silently. I strained to hear, but no sound came. Only the trees seemed to whisper. Then, from all around me, voices rose in unison. Dozens of children's voices whispering together, their words overlapping until they became one chilling sentence. "We've been waiting for you." I stumbled back, heart hammering. The figures didn't move, but I felt them pressing closer, their whispers wrapping around me like invisible hands. My lungs tightened, and I ran. Branches slapped against my arms, roots clawed at my ankles, but I didn't stop until I burst out of the trees, gasping for breath. The town looked the same, quiet and empty under the fading sky. But I could feel them still, watching from the tree line. And in that moment, I realized the truth. The forest wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it had noticed me. Sleep became impossible after that night in the forest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their pale faces glowing in the dark, their lips whispering that same phrase, "We've been waiting for you." By the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. If they were waiting, then maybe it was for me to finally see where they had come from. Maybe there was something in the forest that explained why they had chosen me, why my name had been carved into that photograph decades before my birth. So I went back. The air was heavy and damp, clinging to my skin as I moved deeper into the woods. This time I didn't hear laughter or footsteps, only silence, broken now and then by the snap of a branch beneath my feet. The deeper I walked, the more I felt the forest twisting around me, the paths doubling back on themselves, the trees leaning in as if to watch. Then in a small hollow between the trees I saw it. A bus. Its metal frame was rusted through. The paint peeled away until only patches of dull yellow clung to the surface. Moss covered the wheels, and roots had grown up around it like skeletal fingers clutching the vehicle in place. Its windows were shattered, jagged glass teeth still clinging to the frames. The smell of rust and rotting would fill the air. I stepped closer, my heart in my throat. This was no ordinary bus. It was a school bus. The letters were barely visible, but I could still make them out through the grime. Hollow Creek School District. My stomach turned. I pushed open the door. It screeched in protest, but it gave way and I climbed inside. The air was colder here, unnaturally so. Rows of seats stretched before me, their fabric torn, their frames bent with age. Faded textbooks and scraps of paper littered the floor, frozen in time. But what froze me wasn't the bus itself. It was the windows. Every pane of glass, every surface of smooth metal was covered in scratches. Names, hundreds of them, etched in crooked, uneven letters, carved by desperate hands. I ran my fingers across the glass. The names were familiar. I had heard them whispered by Mrs. Harlow, the list of the missing class. And then I saw it. At the very front, etched deeper than all the others, was my own name. Emily. The sight rooted me in place. The letters were jagged, as if carved long ago, long before I'd even moved to Hollow Creek, long before I'd even been born. My vision blurred. My knees felt weak. If my name was already here, scratched among the lost, then what did that mean for me? Behind me, I heard the faint creak of footsteps, small feet moving slowly down the aisle of the bus. I spun around, but the seats were empty. Still, I knew I wasn't alone. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the bus, the scratched names, and the image of my own etched name among them. Every creak of the house made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to move on its own. I thought I had understood them before, but I hadn't. They weren't just watching. They were waiting. And now, somehow, they knew I had seen the bus. At exactly midnight, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping at my window. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a branch brushing against the glass. But then the tapping turned into small knocks, deliberate, patient. I drew back the curtain. The children were there. Every single one I had ever seen. Pale, still, silent, their eyes fixed on me. And then, without warning, they stepped through the locked window. I didn't scream. I couldn't. It was like my body refused to obey me. They gathered around the room, moving silently, their small feet making no sound on the wooden floor. Their faces were expressionless, yet I felt every emotion they carried. Hunger, longing, loneliness, and something darker I couldn't name. The girl in the white dress came forward, holding her hand out. Her fingers brushed my arm. It was icy, yet the sensation burnt. Her lips moved in that old, broken English, chanting softly. You belong to us. You are always one of us. The others joined, their voices rising in unison, a haunting chorus that filled every corner of the room. I tried to step back, but they closed in, surrounding me. The walls seemed to shrink. The air grew colder, the shadows longer. I realized then that this was no ordinary visitation. This was a gathering, a ritual, a reclaiming. I felt myself drawn toward them, not by force, but by some invisible tether. My name on the bus, my likeness in the photograph, the tally marks on the porch, it had all led to this. And I knew, with a cold certainty that made my heart pound, that there was no turning back. They were not children anymore. Not entirely, but they were what remained of the ones lost long ago. And tonight they had come for me. The following days passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and every shadow seemed alive with their presence. Hollow Creek felt smaller, tighter, like the town itself was conspiring with the forest. Even my parents didn't notice. They went about their routines, oblivious to the dark truth pressing down on me. I knew I had to face it. The bus, the photograph, the tally marks, all of it pointed to one undeniable fact. They had chosen me. Somehow, impossibly, these children, these shadows of children, had been waiting for me long before I had even moved here. One night, I returned to the forest, compelled by a force I could neither resist nor understand. The trees rose like silent sentinels, their branches tangled, black against the moonlit sky. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of earth and decay. And then I saw them, every child, pale and still, standing in a perfect semicircle. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their whispers filled the air. Emily, Emily, Emily. I stepped forward, my legs trembling, my heart pounding in my chest like a hammer. The girl in the white dress held out her hand again. It's time, she said, voice low and melodic. The others echoed her, chanting my name, surrounding me with a cold that seeped into my bones. I wanted to run, to scream, to escape, but I felt my body frozen, held in place by some invisible tether. And then the realization hit me. They had always known me. My name on the bus, the photograph, the tally marks, this was not coincidence. They were waiting for me, always. The forest had claimed them, and now it was claiming me. I backed away slowly, but the shadows pressed closer. Their hands reached out, brushing against my arms, my shoulders, my face. The cold was unbearable, and yet I could feel a strange pull, as though I was being drawn into them, into the forest itself. The last thing I remember before the darkness swallowed me completely was their chorus, rising into the night. We've been waiting, and now you are ours. When morning came, the forest was empty. No trace of the children, no sound, no movement. Only the old, rusted bus remained, half hidden among the trees, its windows glinting faintly in the sun. And I knew, when the next night falls, if I dare return, I might never come back. Hollow Creek keeps its secrets well, but some secrets are patient. Some wait a lifetime, and some wait for you.